Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's public program, The Women's Fight, with Thavolia Glymph. We come to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, president of AAS. We have some newcomers here this evening, so I'll say a few words of introduction to the American Antiquarian Society, a national research library located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We collect, preserve, and share materials printed or published before 1900 in what's now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts. AAS supports and welcomes readers and scholars from around the country and around the world to use our reading room or to seek out digitized materials on our website. We also offer regular programming like tonight's virtual program. I invite you to join us for upcoming program in the weeks and months ahead. This evening's program is the third in a series we are calling Women Make History, and we hope you'll return to see others in this series. You can go to our website for continual updates, including other series related to nature and the environment, artists in the archive, the history of the book, and perspectives from the collections, programs that consider one object in our vast collections from multiple areas of expertise. We thank you for joining us this evening, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help keep this work going. Thank you. And now I'm happy to introduce my colleague, Amanda Kondek, to provide a quick overview on the platform we're using for tonight's program. Amanda?
Thank you, Scott, and good evening, everyone. Closed captioning is available for tonight's program via Zoom's live transcription. You can turn the closed captioning on and off with the button labeled CC on the bottom of your Zoom screen. During the program, I'll be posting relevant links in the chat. If you would like to save the chat for later use, you can download a transcription by opening the chat window and clicking on the three dots in the bottom right corner. If you have any problems with your visual or audio settings, you can also message me. For the Q&A portion of our program, we'll be using the Q&A function located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any questions for our speaker, please type them in there at any point during the program. And finally, we are recording this program and we'll make it available on our website and YouTube channel. So thank you, Scott. Back to you.
Thanks, Amanda. To introduce tonight's speaker, I'm pleased to welcome the Antiquarian Society's 2022 Distinguished Scholar in Residence, Gabrielle Foreman. Dr. Foreman is professor of history, English, and African American studies, and the Paterno Family Chair of Liberal Arts at the Pennsylvania State University. An award-winning teacher, scholar, mentor, and activist, she's the author or co-author of 5 books and editions, most recently, The Colored Conventions Movement, Black Organizing in the 19th Century. Dr. Foreman is the founding faculty director of the Colored Conventions Project, a collaborative research project that's been featured in the New York Times and chosen as a National Endowment for the Humanities Essential, Great Projects Past and Present. Dr. Foreman, welcome.
It's so good to be here today and with everybody who has chosen to spend this evening with the American Antiquarian Society with this exciting program. Dr. Thavolia Glymph began her journey as a scholar at Hampton University and now serves as the Peabody Family Distinguished Professor of History and Professor of Law at Duke University. Her 2020 The Women's Fight, The Civil War's Battles for Home, Freedom, and the Nation, won not one, but 2 major awards from the American Historical Association, and then was awarded not 1, but 3 prizes from the Organization of American Historians, alongside prizes from the Southern Association of Women Historians, the Society of Civil War, and many, many more. We would be here all night, actually, if we were to rehearse the many awards that resulted from the publication of this book. Her first monograph, Out of the House of Bondage, The Transformation of the Plantation Household, was a co-winner of the 2029, I love how we just made the past the present, the 2009 Taft Book Prize, and a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Prize. And she's a recent past president of the Southern Historical Association. And in that same year, 2019, she was elected to the Society of American Historians. And of course, she's also a member of the American Antiquarian Society. The words that are a testament to the scholarly value of her work only speak to the part of her scholarly values, and please hear the plural there, and to the ways in which other scholars regard not only her work, but her example as a modest powerhouse who inspires so many of us. I reached out to a select group of Dr. Glymph's sister historians who attest to her central place in an unprecedented flourishing of scholarship that, and scholars who, center Black women. Speaking about the ways that Dr. Glymph makes Black women in the Civil War visible, Dr. Dinah Ramey Berry writes that Dr. Glymph's, quote, detailed research into both state and private records offers a masterclass of archival mining. Addressing how Dr. Glymph's work connects power relations between white and Black women in the domestic realm to the legal and political history of the 19th century South, Dr. Charla Fett writes that Dr. Glymph shows readers that you cannot separate women's history from the history of the nation. And that just seems pertinent in terms of the series in which she is appearing tonight at the AAS. She goes on to say her complex and powerful work is deeply researched, vividly descriptive, and analytically provocative. It's such a pleasure to be able to introduce her today and to be able to thank you, Dr. Glymph, for your work and for your model. And with that, I will pass it back to Scott and to Dr. Glymph for the wonderful conversation that will ensue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. And we're delighted to have you at AAS this entire year as our distinguished scholar in residence. Thavolia, welcome. We're so pleased that you're here with us this evening. And I'm excited to talk about this book, which I so enjoyed reading. In The Women's Fight, you take a new approach to studying women's roles in the Civil War. The women who populate these pages, and there are many of them, are Northern and Southern, free and enslaved, working class and elite, African American and white. And their experiences, both before and during the conflict, differed vastly, and yet they inhabit the same story in your book. So perhaps it makes sense to start here. What's the story that connects women of such different experiences?
First, thank you, Dr. Scott. And I want to just take a minute also to thank Dr. Foreman for that just beautiful introduction, and also to thank the staff at AAS, and in particular, Nan Wolverton, who reached out to me in 2021, and at that time we imagined an in-person talk. At any rate, I'm delighted to be here and to be in conversation with you. So the question that you ask is in some ways easy to answer and in some ways difficult. It seemed to me when I began thinking about, writing a book about women in the Civil War, first of all, that there were already many, many books on women in the Civil War. And so I had to think about what was it I really wanted to do, and could the archive respond to questions that I had? That is, were there documents that would address some of the questions that I had? And one of the main questions was, why is it that histories of the Civil War and women in the Civil War treat women as if they are disconnected from each other by race and class and region? And it didn't make sense to me to think about women in the war in that way, because it was not how women lived their lives in any fashion. And so I wanted to see what was in the archive that would help me think about the ways in which women across the lines of race and class and region interacted. And I'm always, as a historian, as historians all are, just totally dependent on the archive. And so the archive for me was just wonderful. It was full of of documents that addressed the main question that I had, documents that told me a lot about how women interacted, how they came into contact with each other, and what they had to say about that contact. And so that was sort of the germ, rather, of the book, which was to try to put these women in one place, in one book, instead of having a book about women in the North or a book about women in the South dedicated to slaveholding women or to yeoman class women or to enslaved women. I wanted to treat them in a way that would speak to the way that they'd lived their lives, if that makes sense.
It does, and we're bringing up some slides here that are related to the book. Thanks, Amanda, for bringing these up. And we can continue the conversation. But if you want to give us information about what we're looking at along the way, that's great too. One of the things that I appreciated about the book is how you challenge the categories that people at the time of the war, mostly men, and a lot of historians and other writers since have used to write about women. So for example, when people have talked about Union women or Southern supporters of the Union, they've often been imagined as white, although African-American women, North and South, certainly were also Union women and Southern supporters of the Union. How does rethinking the categories help us see women's wartime experience differently?
I think it's critically important. When we think about the Union, we think primarily, Union women, we think primarily about Northern white women. And to the extent that we include women in the South, we think of Southern white Union women. And so the question to be asked in part is, like, what made a Southern woman a Unionist? Was it her fight for the Union? Did she go to war for the Union? Did she help assist Union soldiers by feeding them or sheltering them? Did she raise her voice in support of the Union cause? Did she move in support of the Union cause? And so there were white Southern women who did those things, but there were more Black women who did those things than there were white women who did those things. So why, it seemed to me, did we not include enslaved women in this category of Unionist? And when I read the archives and I came across, images of Black women with the flag pins, U.S. flag pins pinned to their dresses, women who talked about singing songs about how they were Union women. It just seemed to me to be a dismissal of a very important part of American history by not including African-American women and categorizing them as Unionist women. So what happens when we do that? When we see enslaved women, Black women as Unionists, then we begin to see their politics. They become more than just a swarm of women running to Union lines, but women running to Union lines with a particular political persuasion, with particular political thoughts and ideas about why they're moving. They're not running randomly to Union lines or becoming refugees randomly. These are people who have, for decades, been thinking about slavery and the politics of slavery, who have been thinking about freedom, and who now have this amazing, unprecedented opportunity to make that freedom, while at the same time help to remake the Union, to remake the United States into a nation where slavery did not exist. And so I think when we think about, for example, enslaved women, not only as Unionists, but as combatants and non-combatants, it really helps us to reframe the war and to think about politics differently, to think about women's roles differently, and in particular to sort of dislodge a sort of a prevalent narrative that has only white women capable of being political actors. And of course, I'm not the first historian even to to think about these questions. I mean, I go back to Elsa Barkley Brown's work, when she wrote about the women in Richmond, for example, the Black women in Richmond and their politics. And so this should not surprise us. And the archive is not silent on this question. It's replete with documents that demonstrate the politics of Black women, that demonstrate how their actions were in fact political, and that show their thinking along the way as well.
And your reference to the archive really makes me want to ask about the archives that you consulted, and particularly for actors, for political actors who might not have been writing their own letters, or they might not have left those documents, or those documents hadn't been thought worthy to be collected by archives, by formal archives. How did you turn up these stories? Because this book is really a masterpiece of archival research and detection. Where did you find them, and what kinds of documents give us insight into these lives and these politics?
Well, that's a very good question. The archive, when it comes to enslaved people and the Civil War and even slavery, is, we talk about silence in the archive, but it's not silent when it comes to enslaved people and what they thought and did. Now, of course, we don't have as many records as we would like to have that are written by African Americans during the Civil War, but we have hundreds of such documents, as the Freedmen and Southern Society Project, based at the University of Maryland, that I've been a part of, has demonstrated. Enslaved people, Black people, were writing to the president. They were writing to each other. Women were writing to their soldier husbands. Black soldiers were writing to their children and to their wives and to their lovers. And so we have those documents. But in addition, I think as important to reckon with is that the archive, that what we might consider the archive, the traditional archive, that consists of letters and other kinds of documents written by enslavers or white people, those archives are a tremendous resource as well. I like to say that when slaveholders wrote letters to each other, when they scribbled in their diaries, when they left other kinds of documents, they were not intending for those documents to be read 100 years or 200 years down the road by historians. And certainly they were not intending that they would be read by people like me, a descendant of enslaved people, that I would come along and that other historians, white and Black and Asian and everything, would come along and read those documents and see in them stories, find in them stories about enslaved people that slaveholders did not want told. And so to use one example, when in the book I write, for example, about women who, enslavers or white women enslavers who were trying to reconstruct their households in exile once they were forced to flee from the Union armies. And so many of them wanted to bring enslaved women with them. And in their desperation, their attempts to get enslaved women to come with them, they show us something about those enslaved women who are not writing a letter themselves, but when Anna, for example, tries to get Sarah to come with her and she's begging Sarah to come, she's saying, Sarah, if you come, I'll let you have a house, a really nice house. If you come, we'll make sure that your husband is here. If you come, you can be with your children. So what Anna Oswald is doing is saying to Sarah, I recognize that you love your family. I recognize that you are a political being as well. And so the negotiations I'm having with you, although I don't want to say it bluntly, I'm saying it bluntly, but these negotiations indicate that I see you as somebody who is not just some enslaved person with no thoughts of her own, with no ambitions of her own, with no desires of her own. And so Sarah, the home that Anna Oswald offered Sarah was not the home Sarah wanted. It was not the home she envisioned, because it would still be the home of an enslaved family. And so Sarah, as far as we know, did not join her quote unquote mistress in exile. So it's looking, turning to the same sources that historians have been mining for generations, but overlooking certain things. So historians have been using the official records of the armies and navies of the North and South for generations, but they've ignored the documents that pertain to enslaved people. And so in those very same military records, there are stories of Black women being murdered, of Black women being massacred, of Black women and children having to flee from military fire, of Black women and children who are just trying to cling to the Union Army's coattails to get to freedom. And so, to sum it up, for the most part, I'm using the same sources, the same archives that historians have been using forever. But I'm seeing women who are poor, women who are Black. I'm seeing conflict. There's one of my favorite narratives that comes from the official records. We all know the story of Harriet Tubman's raid, or the raid in which she participated up the Combahee River in 1863, which brought out 750 or so enslaved people to freedom. But when you read the official records, there's also the story there of the Combahee raid that includes a narrative of a young girl, an enslaved girl who's also trying to get on this boat where Harriet Tubman and the other Union soldiers are. She's running to the boats, and the overseer sees her running to the boat, and he tells her to stop. And she refuses to stop. She keeps going. And then he shoots her. And she gets up. She's wounded, but she gets up and she continues to run. And he captures her and brings her back. Now, that's an archival story in not a new archive, but a traditional archive. Is in the OR. And so I'm interested in this little girl who's trying to get to freedom, and what does she know about freedom? And what does she think about, getting to that boat? And so those are the kinds of stories that I'm interested in, as well as stories about poor white women in the archive who have Southern women who've always had a difficult time. But in the war, we see that, their lives become much more difficult, and that elite white Southerners have no qualms about calling poor white Southerners, scum, and berating them in the worst kinds of ways. And so those stories are not, they're not lost. They're there. They just need us to see them. It takes seeing. It takes recognizing that poor white women and enslaved women are people, and that they're in the archive, and all we have to do is to see them, to do this kind of work. It's not magic. It's not. It's just a dedication to archival research.
It is, and to seeing the stories that have been there all along. And when you mentioned the working class, the poorer white women in the South, I'm reminded of how when some of the more elite white women go on the run, some of them become refugees. They run to places where they're in proximity to those poorer white women, and you show how they are in some ways displacing those poor white women in their own communities and then calling the same poor white women scum, even as they, the wealthy women, are the ones on the run. And in a way, you're talking about changing ideas about what home means. How do you see the ways in which people looked at home? How many of these women were refugees? You suggest that many white women, elite white women, didn't become refugees, but it still changed the nature of home for Confederates more generally.
I think home has always been, one of the most interesting categories of analysis for me. Central to my first book and central to a lot of other small pieces of writing that I've done, because we have invested so much in this notion of home. And so at the same time, as a nation, as a people, decisions have been made about who has the right to a home and who does not have the right to a home. So enslaved people were not considered people with a right to a home. And I think that when we look at, all of the work that's been done on the Reconstruction era and the post-Reconstruction era and the untiring efforts of Black people to get land, to build new homes, to reconstitute their families. They're reaching for a new definition of home. They're reaching for a definition that embraces them as well. One of the my favorite narratives is of the woman who, for whom a chicken shack, which was what she had when the war ended, but she was not happy in the sense that this is all I want, but it was her home. It was all, it all belonged to her. She didn't have to, think about a white person coming to tell her when to get up and when to go to bed, and how to, fix up this little chicken shack. So, and home, the idea of home was also central to the way in which white Southerners expressed their need for a new nation, right? That it was a new nation to be built on slavery, but that would also simultaneously allow them to have a particular kind of white home that would be built on slavery. And the Civil War just really upended slaveholders' notion of what home meant, because home meant not just simply a structure, but it meant having white women in the home and Black women in the home too as servants, but white women in the home doing particular kind of gendered work. And when the war forced elite white women in particular, but all Southern white women who were forced out on the road, when it forced them out on the road, it really upended pro-slavery ideology in a very important way. And as I say in the book, it's true that the vast majority of white women did not end up on the road, but the fact that a substantial number did end up on the road is very, very important, because you may not have been out there, but you probably knew someone who was out there trudging along the road without a male escort, trying to find a home, finding a home in some backcountry town or village where the poor white people in those backcountry regions were saying, no, we don't want you here. Don't come. And if you come, it's going to be trouble. And where there was trouble between the elite planter class women and poor white women and their husbands and sons and fathers. So I think the Civil War, in terms of the home, it basically gives us, the documents give us an archive of the disintegration of the home and thus the disintegration of pro-slavery ideology.
Yeah, we have some questions in the chat, and this brings to mind actually a painting that I remember teaching once upon a time. I think it's a painting in which the former slave mistress, enslaver, is visiting African-American women in what is now their home. And it's like she's imposing on their doorstep. And we have several questions about the pictures we've been showing. One question from Kate Steinway is, when were the prints you show published and where were they published? And Jim Donnelly asks, also by whom were they published and with what purpose? There was one that seemed to show the Confederates getting the upper hand. There were others that were photographs. So maybe as we finish with the pictures, you can tell us a bit more about what we were seeing there.
Okay. So this is an image from Nashville, Tennessee, in 1863, a photograph of Black hospital workers. So these are men and women who worked in the Union hospitals. And when we think about the role of African Americans in the war, we tend to just, fall back to glory in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. But what historians are now doing, and myself included, is trying to show the range of Black participation in the Civil War. And this is an indication of that range.
And it's so interesting because also when we think about women in Civil War hospitals, the stories that are often told are of the white nurses, but not of the African-American women who did much of the menial work of those hospitals. And in some ways, white women's kind of middle-class status could be preserved by having African-American women doing some of the hardest and dirtiest of the work.
So this image captures the reality of warfare for Black women in the Civil War. Black women, enslaved women, and freed women, emancipated women were present on so many battlefields. And I make the argument in the book that the battlefield was really everywhere, including on the plantations and including in the homes of enslavers, which had always been militarized and became more militarized during the war. The records of the Union and Confederate armies and navies are replete with reports of Black women and children on the battlefield like this, and they're being captured or killed and fighting on the battlefield. So this demonstrates that theme. One of the stories I tell in the book is a case in which one of the refugee camps was targeted by Confederate forces, and the refugees were overwhelmed by the Confederate forces, and many of the women and children were killed. Some were burned up in cabins, and one of the more horrifying aspects of the story, as it was told by Confederate forces, Confederate officers, and the Union Marine Guard that came down after the battle, was that the Confederate forces had seen some children running away, trying to get to the nearby woods. And on their horses, they had mowed them down. So the story of enslaved women on the battlefield is yet to be written.
Yeah. You mentioned the refugee camps where many African-American women were housed during the war. And that I found one of the most powerful parts of the book, and especially the bonds that women forged in those camps. You trace two women, Louisa Smith and Letitia Taylor, from when they get married, very optimistically in 1863, all the way to a camp at Goodrich's Landing, Louisiana, after their husbands joined the 47th U.S. Colored Infantry. Could you tell us more about these women's experience and what it reveals about their own political vision, and maybe also that of the Union commanders who are running those camps and don't understand what the women are imagining and believing?
Okay, so I started working on women in refugee camps many, many years ago. And since that time, there's been some really wonderful work that's come out on women on refugee camps. And I'm still working on a book on them. And so this chapter is sort of a prologue to the forthcoming book. But Louisa Smith and other women like her who ended up in refugee camps, I'm interested in here I just want to sort of put them there, but in the larger work, I'm saying a lot more about where they came from and what they did in the camps. In this chapter, what I wanted to do is to sort of help the general reading audience see a couple of things. One, that these women, they left slavery in the company of their husbands. They were married actually before the war started. And when they left slavery, it was a family decision, oftentimes a community decision. People left in groups and they go to the waterfront. And so we have to keep in mind the background here. So war's going on, and Grant is trying. General Grant is trying to gain full control of the Mississippi River. And at this point, there's a big effort to sort of get Vicksburg. And in the process of that movement, that military movement, there's a lot of military action on both sides of the river, back and in front of Vicksburg, trying to build canals, figure out a way to get the Union Army in position to take Vicksburg. That military action provides a path for thousands of enslaved people north of Vicksburg to try to get to freedom. And when they see Union gunboats, they seek passage. And the Union gunboats often pick them up. And this is the case with Louisa Smith and her husband and many other people from the plantation where they were. So they get on the boat, and the boat takes the men to an island where Black men are being enlisted into the army. And it takes the women to these camps, these refugee camps. And so in the camps, what it really intrigued me, fascinated me, was the way in which these women took care of each other, the way in which they, when children were left without a mom because the mother died, they moved in to take care of the child. When one woman found a way to gain access to the husband's camp, maybe by becoming a cook, then she became the conduit for messages back and forth between the wives and the husbands, and also bringing money back from the husbands. And what happens in the camps too, it seems to me, and this has to be further sort of pulled apart, is that these women form new kinds of homes, new kinds of households. And when the war ends, we see households with these women of three widows or two widows who have been together since the camps. We see households of women with men to whom they're not linked romantically or by any kind of family tie, forming new kinds of households. So I'm really interested in how Black women's understanding of freedom and home was influenced by their experience in slavery, and that made them want a different kind of home. And we know that oftentimes when Northerners came south after the war, and looked at Black homes, they said, no. This is not proper, this is not right. These homes and the way you're acting is just too communistic. And that was the term that they used because they wanted Black homes to reflect this sort of patriarchal family home. And Black people's experience in slavery had given them other ideas about how homes could be formed and how families could be formed.
And in fact, that connects with a question we have from Anisha Sinha, who writes, "Thanks for this brilliant book, Thavolia. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the manner in which Southern women enslavers sought to commandeer and attack freed women, and the ways in which Northern women reformers and teachers sought to constrain them with their paternalistic racial attitudes. Did freed women perceive them as essentially different or similar in their attitudes and behavior?" So it's partly a question about exactly what you're describing, how Northern women come South and want to impose ideas about home. And did the freed women see that as akin to what they experienced with enslavers?
Thank you, Manisha, for that question. Glad you're here. So yes, as I worked on the book and spent more and more time in the archives, especially the Northern archives, it became clearer to me that the idea of Northern women missionaries, teachers who come South, is such a romantic kind of idea. And the way in which we've talked about it has been very romantic. But when you read the archive, there was very little that was romantic about it. Northern white women, understandably, brought racist ideas and notions with them. You could so easily be anti-slavery, as Manisha well knows. She's done great work on this. You could easily be anti-slavery and also be racist, right? And the notion of the white home had, in some really interesting way, become tied to the Southern white home, expressed as the plantation home. So it's really kind of quite astounding to see so many Northern white women expressing a desire to be a mistress, to see so many of them wanting to live in a plantation home. But not surprising to see so many of them expressing notions that sort of erased Black women as mothers and even as women in their actions, that is, actions of Northern white women, teachers and missionaries. Too often, they saw themselves, and I say this in the book, as the proper mothers of Black children, as opposed to the children's actual mothers. And so I'm really interested in that. And of course, it's not hard to understand when we know that, or keep in mind at least, that Northern elite women, that their wealth was also built on slavery. So when I looked at Northern elite women, I was curious, like, how do you have the time and the resources to be this involved in this particular way? And it was clear that many of them, owned stock in Southern railroads. They owned had interest in Southern insurance companies that insured enslaved people. They owned stock, or their parents did, in sugar refineries in Manhattan. So their engagement with slavery is deeper than we want to sort of admit. And it had a tremendous influence on how they interacted with enslaved women in the South when they came. It was quite disgraceful, I'd say.
It is, and in some ways, at moments, it's almost surprising to read about this if we think about Northern white women who go South as abolitionists, because, as you say, that's abolitionism does not mean anti-racism. I want to just again welcome everybody to put questions in the Q&A, and I'll follow up with about Northern white women, because here too you complicate the story. You show that the story of Northern white women is also divided by race and class, and you have these Northern. Some of the Northern women are working for the Union effort from their homes in the North, and that includes white and African-American women. And then we have these women who travel South as teachers and missionaries. Some of them seem to have confronted their own racist preconceptions about African-American women, but many of them didn't. So the North, the story of Northern women becomes just as complicated.
It is just as complicated. And again, as I said about, we need a book about Black women on the battlefield. We also need a book that I won't be writing about white women in the South, a revisionist account. I think to a large extent, we've been sort of building off of Willie Lee Rose's, amazingly wonderful work, Rehearsal for Reconstruction, and the missionaries there, are they're saviors. But when you read their own letters, they're far from saviors, except if you think that the saving was in commandeering Black life and saying that, okay, now we're in charge of you, not those horrible slaveholders, but we're now in charge of you. And we have plans for you. And it really doesn't matter what your plans for yourself are. Our plans are the most important, which didn't even take into consideration that Black people might have their own notions about freedom and home and family.
Yeah, I remember reading Willie Lee Rose's book in college, I think, and first encountering Laura Town there, and she makes an appearance in your book as well, but from this very different perspective.
Yeah, I was like, Laura Town, how did you become so wealthy here in the teacher's salary?
Exactly. And it turns out she leaves a whole estate when she dies. Where did that come from?
Yeah, and she refuses to leave anything to Black people. So it's another dissertation. Just a book on Laura Town would be fascinating.
Well, exactly. So I'm wondering about the ways in which Northerners, you've talked about how these Northern women imagine themselves as the mistresses of Black women. What do they have any sense of what African-American women want? You talked about how the enslaved woman was kind of bargaining and negotiating with her enslaver at the refugee situation. Do the same kinds of negotiations happen between the Northern missionaries and school teachers and the formerly enslaved women?
They do, and Northern women, they do talk about these encounters, and they express their frustration with Black women who have their own ideas about how things should go. And basically their solution is typically to just, dismiss it out of hand, that these women have no idea what they're talking about, that, one of the stories, I'm not sure it ended up in the book, but of a Northern teacher who said to a Black woman, like, your children would make good servants. And then she proceeds to make arrangements to send them north without asking their mother. The children are sent north and the mother doesn't know until after the fact. So that's, the mother, she knew that the mother would resist her. And so she did it in secret. And again, it reminds me of the way in which slaveholders would try to sell children or other family members before somebody got up, or while the mother was in the field working, and to prevent them from trying to keep the child or beg for the child, or to prevent having to witness the grief on the part of parents who would be separated from their children, whether it was the child sold or the parent sold. And so a reminder that kind of thing where you can take this child and secretly, because you know that if you don't do it, if you do it publicly, you're not willing to deal with the grief that it causes, because enslaved women are not supposed to have grief, which is another really big problem in Civil War literature, that grieving soldiers' wives and grieving mothers are always white, although the archive is full of grieving Black mothers during the Civil War.
It's almost as if the emotional lives of Black women are discounted in, from both the Northern and the Southern white perspective during the war and after.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that for the most part, enslaved women were discounted at the time in a strange way, though, and then discounted by historians. But I say in a strange way because they could not be completely discounted. If they had been, historians like me would not have the records that we have, right? So I say in the book, and it's always in the back of my mind, it's because Black women resisted. It's because they ran away. It's because they demanded that the federal government provide refuge. That's why they're in the archive. And so they are not writing themselves in the archive directly, but they are ensuring that they're there by their actions, because no one wanted them to be following the Union Army. No one wanted them to arrive in Union-occupied cities or military encampments, but they did, even when Lincoln and everybody else was saying, no, we don't want you, stay away. They kept coming until finally it became such a humanitarian crisis and such an embarrassment that the federal government had to do something. But what it did was also an embarrassment.
Yeah. As you think about the meanings of home and freedom and nation that women were contesting during the war, to what degree do you think the war ultimately changed those meanings? Or to what degree did the antebellum conceptions persist for all the social change wrought by the Civil War? It seems at the end of the book that so many of people's pre-war conceptions haven't changed much, even if some people's circumstances have.
That's a really great question. It seems to me that what enslaved women did and what poor white women did as well did have a tremendous impact. It did threaten the social and economic structure of the South. The response that we see, that we tend to equate only in formal political terms, a political response to Black men voting, or a political response to Black people wanting an education. What we miss in that framing is that the Lost Cause movement and all of these other responses are also a response to Black women and poor white women demanding a different kind of free home. And that they were at least momentarily successful was enough to engender this counter attack that said, no, you will not get a free home. So when you look at the Freedmen's Bureau records, which I don't really get into in this book, and I think there are a couple of places where I mentioned it, where Black people are saying, this guy has my wife, or this white guy has my child, and is holding him or her or they in slavery. This is a direct evidence of white former slaveholders and others trying to overturn what Black people are accomplishing and what they had shown vividly during the Civil War that they wanted, what kind of home that they wanted.
And so in a sense, if they are insisting on an antebellum conception, it's in response to Black
It's a
women.
response to.
Yeah.
I mean, that's always the case, right? That sort of racist responses come when they see, some positive movement that threatens racist ideology or white supremacy, to be more precise.
Yeah, we have several questions that have come in. Ellen Moody asks, what did the federal government do to Black women who came north that you described as embarrassing?
No, okay. So what I described as embarrassing was what they did to Black women who entered federal lines in the South. And this is something I talk about in the book. So when the federal government encountered white women refugees, whether they were women who were slaveholders or women who were poor, they treated them kindly. They offered them assistance. Of course, there were many instances when, someone like General Grant or Sherman would say, no, I'm not going to protect your home. But there were others, many more where they said, okay, I'll station a Union soldier to protect your home from vandalism. And poor white women were the objects of concern, not only on the part of the federal military forces in the South, and also the objects of concern for Northern women who were trying to put together, supplies for these women. And when you look at like Northern philanthropic efforts for refugees, they would send white Unionist refugees, these wonderful baskets of food and clothing, even fancy things like wines and jams. And they would send, the coarsest of things to Black women and children refugees when they sent anything at all. So that's one problem. The other problem that statement referenced, and is that the federal government, when Black women and children came into these camps or were placed in these camps, thought unlike any other women in the Civil War, we have to put them to work. We're not going to ask white women refugees to work, but Black women have to work. And so the camps become, in some places, kind of a way station. Women are in the camps, and then they're funneled to plantations that the federal government has leased out or is running itself in some capacity to grow cotton. And then the sort of, on top of that, the federal government allows a tax to be imposed on the wages of enslaved women. Now, of course, during the Civil War, the federal government enacts the first, income tax, but it's on wages over $800. So in effect, Black women were the only women being taxed during the Civil War. And ostensibly, as I write in the book, the tax was to pay for food and clothing for refugees who were elderly or children who were orphaned and that sort of thing, people who could not work themselves. but that money ended up in what was called the Freedmen's Fund, that it took me years to track down the records for. And the Freedmen's Fund was used to pay for doctors for freedmen's hospitals, to pay for things that had nothing to do with freed people or Black people. And when the war ended, there was a substantial amount of money left. And as I write in the book, what has also been missed in the historiography is that the money that came from taxing Black women's labor during the Civil War that was placed in this fund, what was left when the war ended was given to Black colleges, or what are now HBCUs, like Howard University. And so the founding of these Black colleges owes a lot to the labor of Black women in the South during the Civil War. Another story that needs to be told at length, and I just kind of mention it in this particular book.
But that's a story that reveals something about those institutions that is different from what we usually think.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. We are at the end of our time. Our hour is drawing to a close. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions that were asked. But I would encourage folks to pick up the book, The Women's Fight. It is fantastic. Some of the other questions were about, on the one hand, the state of war that existed between Southern enslavers and enslaved Black women. And on the other hand, a different question that came up is, were there ways that women worked together across race and class lines? And I think, if you'd like, we can go to that before we close and take those two, the state of war on the one hand, the potential for working together on the other.
The state of war between enslaved women and
Southern enslavers in this case. That's a question.
I mean, I've long maintained. I've long maintained in my work that there was a state of war. There had to be a state of war. That white homes had long been militarized, in which Black women worked. And so when the Civil War comes and we see white women enslavers pulling out their pistols, we should not be surprised. Those pistols had been in white homes all the while. And we know very little about that aspect of Southern history and slavery. So I call them militarized homes for a reason. And the second, very quickly, yes, there were certainly instances of collaboration and goodwill between some Northern white women and enslaved women. And I have a couple of examples in the book, but I didn't do much with that, or as much as maybe I could have, because I thought that, that story had been told and told well by people like Manisha Sinha, the great work that abolitionist women in the North did. Unfortunately, not enough of those women who were doing that kind of work and who had sufficient sympathy for Black women, not enough of them came to the South during the war.
Yeah. Dr. Glymph, thank you so much for this conversation. We really appreciate your joining us this evening and sharing the fruits of extraordinary research in your book, The Women's Fight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. And to all of you who've been watching, thank you for being here tonight. If you'd like to recommend this program to friends, our public programs are available on the AAS YouTube channel. We have a number of programs coming up in the next month, including the next one in our Women Make History series this Thursday night, April 7th, when Taya Miles will talk about her National Book Award winning All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, A Black Family Keepsake, another remarkable revelatory book. Please check out this program and many more at our website, americanantiquarian.org, and you can watch previous programs on the YouTube channel. For now, thank you so much and have a good evening.